What's really good, everybody? This is Nathan Allenbach, and welcome to the podcast where we get into people's stories and go down a bunch of rabbit holes about what's really good in the world. All right, I currently have like 5 unreleased episodes because I haven't had any time to edit the show recently. If you are a regular listener, you know this is nothing new for me, so I'm really sorry for being so inconsistent lately. I've been writing a lot and taking care of a foster dog and a bunch of other stuff. But just know there's some great interviews in the pipeline that I think you all really enjoy, and I promise I'll catch up soon, okay? Anyway, let's just get right into today's conversation. I had the pleasure of speaking with Ralph Leonard. Ralph is a writer who spent a lot of time making political commentary on Twitter, which is how I found out about him. I was immediately drawn into his historical and economic takes around race and class and other forms of identity, particularly his critique of identity politics, which he makes from the left using class struggle dialectics rather than from the reactionary right, which is where you hear most of the critiques of identity politics. And he identifies as a leftist, particularly a libertarian Marxist, and he also considers himself a secular humanist. So I swear, one look at his Twitter bio and you can totally tell why he's so into identity. It's great. And it's a topic we dive into a bunch on this show, and I don't think enough from just a strictly political framework. Like, we got into how identity weaves into the conversation of race and class, and how important it is to historically understand it and utilize it in today's political discourse. We also got into the culture wars as a whole, just of the past few years, and how terms like liberal or classical liberal or libertarian and leftist have kind of all evolved in like mainstream rhetoric, while certain figures have opportunistically manipulated the playing field, like Dave Rubin. And it's just an interesting topic insofar as how we use linguistics and we categorize political identity. We also touched on like censorship and platforming and just all that fun stuff that kind of comes with the whole culture war discussion. Ralph is super versed in history and philosophical source material, and I really wish I had more time to deep dive with him here, but I think we got into some interesting territory for all of you. The audio did get a little choppy at points, I guess, since we were talking with an ocean between us, so don't mind the lag. I pieced it together the best I could. And yeah, as always, if you dig or don't dig the show, please review it on iTunes. All feedback is appreciated, and hit me up on social media, wherever, for all other needs. I'm just at Nathan Allenbach in all of them. So yeah, I guess that's it. Now let's get into what's really good. Ralph Leonard, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So this is the first time we've spoken. I know I followed you on Twitter a little while back, and we were just talking a little bit before we started recording here about how I found you and why I found you so interesting, just because not only are your political takes pretty hot and just something I find not just agreeable, but just more rare, I guess, for a lot of your positions on things, but you also have just a unique Twitter bio describing your identity and your background. So I guess for my own sake, before we jump in here and get into some of these topics, and for the people listening, could you just briefly unpack a bit on your background and your political worldview?
Okay, well, I'm from Britain, or the United Kingdom, though I'm a Republican, so I don't believe we should have a monarchy, but I'm also a secular humanist, leftist, and someone who will call himself a Marxist as well. Well, I call myself a conservative Marxist, which is more of a tongue-in-cheek thing. But as to give a more approximation, I'm more, a libertarian Marxist is more accurate, if you like.
Right. Would you identify as a left libertarian in a way?
Sort of, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was we were talking a little bit on Twitter before we started recording just about like what we wanted to get into here. And I really particularly on what you post about, I enjoy your critique of identity politics from a leftist position, which I think at least I've found it to be pretty rare in online circles, at least outside of the sort of like dirtbag left sect, I guess you could say, of the more like socialist left. And I think you'd agree that it mostly like the viewpoint that critiques identity politics in today's like culture wars, like it mostly comes from people on like the new right and like reactionaries. So, I mean, there's a lot that we could jump into here, but I guess just to get us started, because this is what I want to spend the bulk of our time on. Like, how would you describe your underlying critique of identity politics?
Well, first of all, the question of identity politics is a rather complex question, because what we call identity politics is usually associated with the left and comes out of what were called the new social movements that grew around the 1960s. So feminism, gay rights, black liberation, third world liberation struggles. And at the time, those movements were, I think, a good thing, because they did press on very, very real issues like questions of racism and oppression of women and oppression of gay people and lesbians and so on. And they did come out of reaction against first the society that was oppressing them and a critique of the mainstream left at the time that was ignoring their struggles. So, I was very indifferent at best to, questions of racism and sexism, partially because of a sort of a very reactionary workerism that existed on the left for a while, that partially comes out of Stalinism, that makes a fetish out of the working man, and I mean man very literally. So it had a very limited notion of what the working class was, and so it sort of saw it as very white, very male, industrial, and so on. However, those movements over time degenerated into sort of identity, what we call identity politics, main for very complex reasons. And one of them was how sort of notions of solidarity changed. So instead of solidarity being, uniting people across differences, it became very narrow. So it sort of focused on people who were like you. So and also because universalistic identities sort of disintegrated. So with the decline of class politics, the collapse of communism, which sort of posed itself as the universal liberation alternative to capitalism, then people sort of retreated into sort of narrow identities to defend, their rights. And this is something that's a global trend. So in the third world, or what is called the third world, the various anti-colonial nationalistic movements themselves sort of degenerated into identitarianism, with stoking ethnic and sectarian conflict, as we can see in many, many countries now. So my opposition, if you like, to identity politics comes from, it's not that we shouldn't fight against racism, sexism, or homophobia. It's how you do so. And I don't think, limiting yourself or existing in little silos helps you with that.
Right. So, I mean, from your perspective, then, I guess, as a self-identified Marxist, like, would you, I guess, ascribe in our current, I guess, world politics, would you ascribe the class political system of the I should say the outlook toward different people groups as a more unifying or more pragmatic approach to our differences over the more like gender, race, identity politics, or is there some type of like third way that we should be looking at?
I think it's more, I would more go for a third way, because it's more, for me, there's a much more underlying issue, which is the more sort of a lack of a more universal humanistic politics that can help overcome these problems we face. Because, you know, you hear this phrase, because whenever we discuss identity politics, some of its defenders will say all politics is identity politics, which to me is a little bit of a cop out, and it's so saying, there's good identity politics and there's bad identity politics, and the way we do this is by supporting so-called good identity politics against bad identity politics, when I think there has to be an alternative, which is to sort of try and revive a more universal and humanistic way of viewing solidarity and fighting oppression.
Right. Well, I'd be interested to hear your take on this thought. This is something I've kind of been batting around in my head recently on the topic. I mean, to your point of the critics who say like all politics or identity politics, I mean, I kind of understand where some of those critics are coming from, only in the sense where it almost feels like everything that makes us in a way has like an inevitable impact on our worldview and like our place in the world, like I guess as a whole, you know. I mean, like if, you know, you're born, it doesn't matter like if you're born, you know, like a white middle class man or a, you know, like Asian upper class man or whatever it might be. Like you still, like however you're born, like your race, your gender, your class, like these different forms of identity inevitably play some type of role shaping who we are. So like well,
identities are important because, you know, they give people a sort of a grounding in the world and a way to view their relationship to the world. But politics should be a way not of sort of affirming our identities, but as a way of trying to transcend them.
So in a way, it almost sounds like it's a problem of emphasis. Then, in a way, so it's like we should be acknowledging that personal identity does have a role insofar as how we view ourselves and how we view our place in the world, but it shouldn't be a leading, dictating factor that shows our political stances and like shows where we should be taking or how we should be identifying various different identity groups. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but also even that, the various sort of communist and even radical anti-racist movements were sort of trying to build a society where you wouldn't have racial divisions, where the whole idea of race became utterly redundant, and that a new human society, or a new man, as Trotsky once put it, would rise up in its place. Now, you may say that that was a utopian view, but the moral force behind it was in the right direction.
Right, because I mean, like, I guess, and we can talk a little bit about this, I mean, like, as we've seen today now, I mean, there's all these identitarian and reactionary movements popping up all over the world, and I guess what's troublesome for me and how I view at least I guess we could be charitable and we can call it the fringe of identity politics on the left, which are primarily in this social justice neoliberal subgroup, and it seems to me in some eerie way, like a lot of the rhetoric and the views that they're starting to espouse are starting to seem similar in a way to a lot of what the alt-right and white nationalist subgroups are saying in their rhetoric, which is, and this should go without saying, obviously, that I'm not drawing moral equivalency at all here, but just pointing out the rhetorical similarities, because, you know, it's interesting how the white nationalists particularly, you know, they're all about preserving white identity, and it's like, oh, like we have to separate the races and we have to, preserve our culture. And a lot of them point to a lot of like black nationalist type groups and people in that, rough category. And they'll be like, we understand like where they're coming from because they're just trying to preserve their identity and we're trying to preserve our identity. And that's when you kind of reach this toxic, I guess you could say just like overflow of just focus on identity. So do you see that at all, or is that like an overreach, you think?
That's sort of true, but at the same time, there is a slight misconception that the left created identity politics and, well, the right are just adopting it in reaction. But if you really want to look at this historically, what identity politics originated from the reactionary right. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, which, it came up as a reaction against the French Revolution and Enlightenment universalism. So in the Romantic movement, you had various thinkers who emphasized difference and, the uniqueness of each Volk or group. And, you had, various thinkers like Joseph de Maistre, who said, I see a German, a Russian, and an Italian, but I've never seen man, i.e. man, the universal category representing humanity. He said, I've never seen him before. And if anything, it's the left that borrowed the rhetoric of the right on identity politics, not the other way around. So if you like, these various alt-right, neo-fascist, identitarian movements that we see now are, in effect, going back to their roots.
Yeah, it's all been politicized at this point in the culture wars, where like I think the right, or I guess we could say the far right in this instance, depending on how we want to frame it, is done. Unfortunately, they've done a remarkable job at kind of owning the battleground in a way where they were able to claim like the term identity politics as this bad thing that the left came up with, at least in I'm talking current culture war positions, but and that's become like a huge issue then, because like you have this weird split between, I guess, what we could call like the white nationalist, far right, alt right, whatever, like amorphous blob we want to call that, which are the people that are focused on identity, and they actually are basically critiquing conservatives and critiquing neoliberals just by being like, hey, identity does matter. You guys are critiquing the left and you're critiquing identity politics. Here's why it does matter. And then you have like the kind of reactionary culture war types who are, like your centrist grifters and your neocons and your people that are just like in the kind of just general right who they're fighting the culture
people
wars.
like Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, exactly.
People like that.
And they've essentially, they're the ones that own the space. Like they're the ones who they just have done such a great job marketing all these terms. Like, I mean, like even just like someone like Jordan Peterson who literally made up this term, what is it, like neo-Marxist postmodernists. Like these are terms that
cultural Marxism.
Or cultural. Exactly. Like they do such a good job marketing these really like boogeyman terms, and then you're right, it becomes this thing where when most people approach the topic of identity politics, like if you run a quick Google search or if you run like a YouTube search on the term, a lot of what you're going to see is like framing it like the left created it and that it's the left's fault that this thing emerged because of the way the argument's been framed.
Yeah, and people like that sort of critique left-wing identity politics like in a very disingenuous way, because what they're really trying to do is legitimize various social movements that have very real issues, sexism and homophobia, and they just want to delegitimize that and say, oh, these problems don't exist, and to point out these injustices is to commit the injustice itself. So if you point out racism, you're guilty of identity politics. Ipso facto, you're a racist.
Right. I mean, yeah, like exactly. That's exactly. This is why I wanted to talk to you, because like you are someone who's riding this weird line as someone who is critiquing it from the left? Because, I mean, like you said, the past few years of the culture wars, I mean, especially online, since the term identity politics has been largely hijacked by grifters on the right and just like, and I shouldn't even say just grifters, but like just the general right, like your Ben Shapiro's and your Dennis Pregers and all of them, as a mean to discredit minority voices that are pushing up against the status quo. And then it also helps just to reinforce their own pre-existing positions and all that. So I mean, like, for you personally, like, how do you walk that line between like staying true to yourself and your own critiques that are based obviously in like a pretty strong class and just general like ideological stance, but like how do you balance that between not falling into this just easy grift that it's everywhere on Twitter, on YouTube? Like, you could easily, you know, as someone who identifies on the quote-unquote left, you could easily make a killing by just, like, all of a sudden, like, almost subtly selling yourself out to these, like, center-right and right-wing grifters who talk about this stuff in a similar way that you do. Right. So how do you do that?
Or do the Dave Rubin and say, I've left the left, continue to bash the left.
Exactly.
I mean, there is no easy way to sort of walk the fine line. But I mean, all I can do is just say what I believe to be true and to read widely and to be self-critical.
Do you personally feel that you have allies and that you have like some form of a tangible and sizable like political tribe that you can identify with that kind of like reinforces this critique of yours, or do you feel like largely isolated?
To a degree, yes. And that would be from a fellow section of the left, who, broadly speaking, share the same politics. You know, they believe in, you know, because I used to be a Trotskyist, and you know, there is a sort of a strand of Trotskyism called the Third Camp, and which is, you know, associated with, you know, thinkers like, you know, one of my heroes, C.L.R. James or Hal Draper, Max Shachtman, and, you know, that section of the left, I think, does a good job in, you know, walking the fine line in critiquing identitarianism and sort of, you know, reactionary cultural politics that's given a pseudo-left spin, and at the same time, you know, wanting to overcome racism and other forms of oppression, because ultimately the critique of identity politics is that it doesn't get to the root of the oppression that it attempts to do right, because ultimately, if you want to get at the root of it, then it will have to be a critique of capitalism and trying to foster a more universal notion of solidarity. So
if you were in a position where you were trying to pitch that to like a neoliberal, say it's a liberal, say it's a centrist, say it's a conservative, but say they have an open mind to listening to your critique, like if you're trying to pitch this, I guess, approach of paying attention to class and critiquing capitalism as a front-running means to approaching like these topics of sexism, racism, etc. Like how would you do that in a way where the people who are opposed to you ideologically could hear what you're saying, you think?
Well, I would say that there were, because first of all, that the critique of identity politics is not a white male thing, that there have been many quote-unquote people of color who have critiqued identity politics from the standpoint of anti-racist and anti-colonial struggles, like, for example, C.L.R. James, who I mentioned before, who was very, very resolute in his opposition to imperialism and racism, yet he had no time for like any sort of notion of negritude or identitarianism, and that, as he sort of said many times, that the way you defeat racism is never going to be achieved through a very sort of narrow notion of cultural politics.
Yeah, this kind of, it reminds me, similarly at least, I don't know if it was necessarily as explicit, I forget if it was explicitly on the topic of identity politics, but it sort of fits into this framework of, I guess, Marxism versus neoliberalism. But I remember it might have been like a year ago or 2 years ago when Cornel West came out.
Can I ask you, Will, when you say neoliberalism in this context, what are you trying to describe?
No, very good, because I've run into this a bunch with friends. I essentially just mean capitalist in this context, at least.
Because a lot of this discussion on identity politics within the left, shall I say, is really like an argument between, say, Marxists and broadly what you may call progressive liberals, who are quote unquote the pro-identity politics side. And I think what you have to be careful in not to overly demonize your opponent and say, oh, they're just all these sort of cynical and self-interested actors, when I think many of these progressive liberals who talk in that sort of identity politics term do so out of sort of a genuine belief.
Right.
They argue it because they genuinely think that's the best way to defeat racism, the oppression of women, homophobia, transphobia, so on and so forth. So you do have to be careful when you make this critique as well.
No, yeah, absolutely. That's so true, and it's good to point out because I've run into the same issue in a bunch of conversations and just fell for it myself, just in how we kind of parse out like our linguistics and defining these terms and these groups, because it gets so messy so quick. I mean, like for someone, especially like even across the Atlantic, I mean, like how Americans and Europeans identify the political spectrum and how we use different terminology, it can really, it can mess up very easily like what we're even trying to say before we even get to say it. So while you were talking, I quick ran a Google search on this just to make sure I wasn't misspeaking. But all I was trying to get at was, look, what year was this? This was so it was like 2 years ago. Cornel West made some critique. He called Ta-Nehisi Coates essentially like he called him, and I quote, the neoliberal face of the black freedom struggle, which essentially, like, and Ta-Nehisi Coates represents more or less in what you're saying, like the progressive liberal side of identity politics, where he's kind of like one of the front runners, at least, of that category over the past several years, where he's brought the issue of race like really into the mainstream in a big way. And it's interesting.
Yeah, his essay on reparations, that's what made him a big name.
Right. Yeah, and like I think it was like a book. But yeah, and anyway, like I think like that's a good, between the two of them is like an interesting and good I guess example to point to in all of this, insofar as public figures with completely different fundamental views on the world, whereas like Cornel West is like approaching it from more of that like Marxist class struggle perspective, and then Ta-Nehisi Coates is approaching it more from like the specific like identity politic of the black experience in America, like representing the progressive liberal side. And I do think, to what you've been saying, like I definitely think that there's a lot to take in, like just from that conversation in general. Because I think for someone like, I'm trying to think, like for someone like me, or for the people, like a lot of the people that are in my like relative community, like I'm in a pretty affluent white community, and it's pretty easy for someone like me, or at least someone that has a similar upbringing and similar traits to me, to look at what someone like a Ta-Nehisi Coates is saying and feel demonized, almost to your point before, like, and how we like kind of like use our terminology, and like we want to like frame things in the best way, I guess, when talking about like our political opposition. And this is a critique of mine, I would say, of that progressive liberal identity politic camp, because like for me personally, like I'm at a stage where I don't feel necessarily like offended or hurt in any way when I hear Ta-Nehisi Coates speaking about like calling like white people like white supremacists, or using terminology like that's like a little bit more I guess we'll just say strong, like against like white people in a way. And for me personally, like as someone who's like, I've read a bit of his work, and like I can understand where he's coming from to the degree that I feel like I need to, at least to like empathize with his view and try to understand like where that just that broader like group of like the identity politic left is coming from, because like it is so far removed from my own personal experience that like I feel like it's my duty, I guess, as someone who's interested in these topics, to really like try to understand like where he's coming from. But to your point, I still do think, when it comes to actually like the broader rhetorical games that we're playing in the culture wars, that language often falls short in terms of like influencing the people it needs to influence. Because most of the people that I know, like let's just say like in the community that I grew up in, like I said, like kind of a mix of lower middle class and then affluent white people as a majority. Like most people in this category that would hear his rhetoric would be pretty, I guess you could just say, scared away. Whereas like how Cornel West approaches the rhetorical game of class warfare, it's a much more all-inclusive approach, and it's more systemic. So just, I guess from your perspective, like how do you view because obviously they're completely different, and there's a lot of like pros and cons we can nitpick out from both of those camps, but like how do you navigate that space in the culture war specifically between maybe like the good points that someone like a Ta-Nehisi Coates is making, but then also like, because I know you're a Marxist, like the more underlying class worldview of someone like Cornel West?
Firstly, you have to avoid what is sometimes described as class reductionism. I personally don't like that phrase, but I know what it's trying to describe, which is like having a very sort of too economistic sort of focus on things, where you reduce everything to economics or economic determinism. Everything is economics, where you sort of ignore sort of questions of oppression and injustice. To give you an example, in Britain during in 1963, there was a sort of protest movement by sort of black people against in Bristol against the bus unions, against discrimination against black people, and the sort of local socialist group sort of wrote an article about it, which was it obviously came off as this sort of class reductionist approach, where it said, well, why we have to focus on capitalism, and that sort of typified really what you shouldn't do. Right. Because, obviously in that situation, there was a very clear problem. It's like, no, the problem is the oppression, that the specific act of discrimination that was being protested against. So you have to avoid that. But I think it also has to require I think the only way you can really resolve this is through, a solidarity, is through actually, engaging in these political struggles, like against sort of racism, against black people, against oppression, against women, that, we can all see that that you have to sort of engage with these questions. And I think through that, you can sort of build a more universalistic, emancipatory politics, because that's the only way.
Right, yeah, because like that's a great point. Because I know over the years I've noticed several like charges of racism, or at the very least, I guess you could say, just like not colorblindness, but just like ignoring oppression and like ignoring personal identity in a lot of instances on like in leftist circles, which I think is it's more common than most people would assume on the left, because like there is that tendency to only see things through class, which is like kind of what I'm trying to get at, like in balance in between those two perspectives.
Or more having a very narrow view of what class struggle is. Because a lot of this debate within, because you've probably heard of these debates around, is it race or is it class? These race versus class debates, where if you get to the nub of it, it's really a debate between what you may call social democratic redistribution versus Medicare for all versus race specific policies like reparations. And to me, those kinds of debates are not that interesting because they're very, very narrow, very sort of technocratic, very sort of too policy orientated, where what has to be done is a much more emancipatory, universalistic movement from below.
In a way, it almost sounds like you're describing intersectionality for like leftism.
I'm not. I don't think. Well, that's a whole other. The question of intersectionality is a whole other debate.
I'm sort of just messing with you, but it is interesting. Like to your point of painting.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
By it. I know what you mean. So, like, for example, the question of Black Lives Matter and police violence against or police surveillance and violence against various black communities within the United States is part of the class struggle. That's what I mean, because it shouldn't be just class struggle shouldn't be seen in this very sort of narrow, the state about economic redistribution, but a much more emancipatory notion of it.
Right, and I definitely think you see this. I mean, it just goes to show, like anything else, that we all have this binary tendency to, when we slip into a worldview, like, say, Marxism or socialism or some various sect of leftism, that there's this easy tendency for each of us to look at whatever, we look through whatever lens that we view as, like, the thing. Like, we almost make it like a religious type of model, you know what I mean? I think this is it's a really solid critique. Yeah. And this is why I really appreciate your takes on it. Cause I mean, it's something that I come from more often, or more so the intellectual dark web corner of the web. I mean, that's kind of like prior to, like getting more involved in like leftist communities and circles. Like that was back in like 2014, 2015, like that's really where I spent a lot of time. And it's interesting because like I make the same critique now from like for that, I guess you could say like political identity or whatever you want to call it, movement, because they do the same thing. It's like it's all these people like Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson or Dave Rubin who they've essentially created this tribal identity where it's like infallible views, like they have this viewpoint of the world where they see everything through, like everything is seen through the lens of free speech, and it's all seen through the lens of censorship and individuality, and it's essentially like conservatism just repackaged in this kind of like new, I guess, new age way where like they're a little bit more liberal
speak.
Exactly. So it's interesting because I mean I think that critique, it seems so obvious, but I guess it's so hard for each of us to do because like as someone who came from that group, like more than anything, when I look back on those figures and like the groups within that category, like all I want is for those people to have like a good self-criticism of where they place themselves on the political spectrum, but they can't do it. Like they refuse to acknowledge that, you know, the people on these various. Oh, sorry. What was that?
No, I was just going to say that the IDW types, you know, they like make a fetish out of their sort of opposition to the left, social justice, and identity politics, and that leads them to take up some very reactionary positions.
Right, exactly, and that's its own beast. Obviously, like I'm not trying to, like with all of this. I mean, none of what we're talking about here, like we're trying to draw like direct equivalencies between these groups. But I do find it interesting.
Like with Jordan. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I find it interesting, like kind of talking about kind of like this leftist self-critique of just being able to identify like when this ideology of looking at the world through class as like reductionist means, like I think it's so important to be able to self-criticize wherever we fall on the map in a way that's like it leaves us open to like where these other parts of the political map are maybe like they have a good point, you know, like maybe some of like the progressive identity politic types have a good point in some of these areas, and it just becomes this like severely binary way of looking at the world when we're just like, you have to see it through class, or you have to see it through race and gender, or you have to see it through individuality and like free speech and all these other things. So it's like, it's just interesting how like we need to get better, I think, at addressing like our own self-criticism, where we fall on the map, in order to embrace a more holistic outlook when we approach these issues. That's all I was trying to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like insofar as specifically, I don't want to lose the topic of the IDW completely, because I know we kind of touched on it earlier, and I know that you and I probably have fairly similar critiques of them, and like similar critiques of the grifters like Dave Rubin. So I mean, like when you look at figures like them, like figures like Tim Pool or Sargon of Akkad, or these types of people who they guise their political outlook as, like you said earlier, like quote unquote being on the left, while almost exclusively like espousing right-wing rhetoric to a right-wing audience. Like how do you explain the emergence of figures like that, or like what's your take on them?
I mean, they are a very strange phenomenon because I know Sargon came out of like Gamergate. Mm-hmm. That's when he sort of really became prominent out of the whole Gamergate thing, and, you know, attacking Anita Sarkeesian because she, you know, pointed out about, you know, she made a video about certain sexist tropes that exist in the video games, and then Sargon started bellyaching about feminism and how, you know, it's encroaching on our freedoms and et cetera, et cetera. And then I think some of it, comes out of this, you know, want to be like a controversialist. You know, some of them also for Hitchens for the wrong reason, if you get what I mean.
Right.
Because, you know, Hitchens, who, you know, used to be a part of the left, but then left the left and started critiquing the left from the left, sort of thing.
Yeah, he sort of became like a neocon.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, and because he was very good at it, and had a lot of controversial opinions on various topics. So, and his sort of internet presence, I think, sort of helped sort of inspire a kind of a generation of rather pathetic imitators like Sargon and Tim Pool and a lot of these other characters, wannabe Hitchens provocateurs. And I try not to take them seriously. There's nothing to them. They have no. Tim Pool, I'm sorry, is not that bright. He's, you know, there's nothing to anything he says. And while Sargon tries to be this sort of shock jock, social justice, anti-SJW, you know, and, you know, recently here in the UK, he's been a lot of fire for his comments about Jess Phillips, the whole "I wouldn't even rape you" tweet he did like a few years ago. Yeah, have you been following the story?
Yeah, he's getting milkshakes thrown at him.
Yeah, and the sardines as well. But they have had a toxic influence as well, because they have helped sort of legitimize very sort of reactionary, sexist, racist, and transphobic sort of points of view that covers itself in a anti-SJW, pro-liberal sort of trappings.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest issue, I think, with engaging with them, or even like just commentating on them, is the fact that they've been over the years so dominant in the culture wars, like especially on platforms like YouTube and a bit on Twitter and like in podcasts, but I know it's primarily YouTube, and then it kind of like sinks down in layers. They get, and it's like Reddit and 4chan and 8chan and all that. But I mean, like even just on the face, because YouTube is a very accessible public platform, and insofar as like getting information out there, like it's a lot more visceral than Twitter per se. Like if you're on YouTube and your face is there and you're communicating these ideas to people, like it's a lot more easy, I think, for those ideas to sink in to the viewer versus like if you see ideas written in a tweet. So it does make for like a pretty I don't want to call it scary, but it's just like it's difficult to even know how to approach these figures, because I mean, like they're not honest actors, and like it's funny because they use that phrase all the time to discredit people on the left, but I mean it's true. Like I'm sure you've watched enough content from them and like quote unquote debates, but it's like they just clearly are like they're just lying about so much of what they say, and they're mischaracterizing like statistics and ignoring things where it's convenient for their narrative. And I don't know what the best or the most helpful way to approach them is at this point. Like, do you have any ideas of like moving forward in the culture wars, like from a, I guess, like speaking specifically from your own perspective, like from a leftist take, like do you find any means to be the most effective at approaching them other than just throwing milkshakes, I guess?
I don't know, because I try to just ignore them and ignore that whole YouTube scene. I don't really have a lot of time for them, because their critiques of the left are very shallow, and they're so intellectually lightweight. They're so ignorant about so many issues that I just don't see, for me personally, I don't see why I have to gain in confronting them. Because my whole critiques of identity politics and questions of universalism and humanism is totally different for them. And I think much more tries to get to much more intellectually deep,
like the bedrock, yeah.
So that people actually sort of gain an understanding of these various and very complex problems which we face. For them, it's just they just see all these questions as a way to attack white men, which is identity politics for me.
Right.
I mean, they practice the thing they preach against.
Exactly.
Stuff like calling Black Lives Matter anti-white or a terrorist organization. You know where they're coming from when they say that.
Right.
That's a red flag.
Yeah, I think especially like people like Sargon, or especially now, I should say, someone like Stefan Molyneux, who's just taken a sharp turn in the past year or so.
He's a white nationalist.
Yeah, like it's undeniable. Yeah, it's undeniable at this point, and it's so reaffirming to people like you or I, who have relatively followed the culture wars in the past few years, just to look at these figures. And like over the years, people on the left, specifically I'll say leftists, because like I think I think people in the identity politic, progressive circles, roughly speaking, although of course there's exceptions, of course there's people making solid critiques in there. I think a lot of them have fallen over the years for the traps that the people in these reactionary right camps are setting. You know, like the people like Stefan or Ben Shapiro or Milo, like these people who are essentially like they've baited the social justice types, you know, to come out and to grant them these sound bites, and that's kind of like how they've built their careers essentially. And it's so reaffirming at this phase, because for years now, I think people in leftist circles have been critiquing those like Stefan Molyneux or Sargon by being like, hey, these guys are focusing, you know, on white identity politics. Whether or not they overtly say that, that's exactly what their rhetoric is pointing towards, and they know it. Like, it's very clear, like in the audiences that they've cultivated, and like the style of a rhetorical approach. Like, it's all very. It's very apparent, I think, for people who can see through it. I mean, it's a little harder, I guess, if you're, you know, a big fan of these guys and you're maybe at the mercy of their charisma. You know what I mean? But like for people on the outside, I think they've been calling this out for a long time, and it's only been, you know, the past year or so where like Sargon, I know, has joined UKIP, and then Stefan has just like overtly come out making white nationalist statements, you know, talking about how, you know, like the people in Poland, they've got it right because it's a white homogenous country, and just like it's a very strange time, because like these evolutions within the culture wars happen so slightly. Like they don't happen overnight in a way where if you were just some impressionable young kid and you were following these characters, that you could intuit on your own, like, oh, this person must be bad, or this person must be wrong for this. You know, it's a gradual thing.
Yeah, and I can see what makes them, at least in the beginning, what made them attractive was the fact that they did sort of argue from a point of a sort of superficial libertarian values.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we stand for freedom, free speech, the rights of the individual, while the SJWs, these cultural Marxists and feminists, are trying to suppress it through their use of identity politics and anti-free speech, you know, no platforming, you know, that whole debate.
Right.
And then when people get sucked into it, then, you know, the mask starts to fall off.
Yeah, it's a very slippery time for internet culture in this way, just because I think, you know, and a lot of this comes down to playing this game where the people who are in those circles, even the overt white nationalists like Richard Spencer, you know, like these guys, or even maybe like slightly less overt ones like Tommy Robinson, who, you know, depending on his audience, like he will be overt, but like if he's like the people like Richard Spencer or Tommy Robinson, when they go on certain platforms to speak about their views, they know when to dumb it down and when to sanitize, I should say, their views, and then they know when to drum up their audience. It's like a game. So a lot of, for the critics, for like the people on the outside like us who are trying to point toward these figures and try to, like, I guess, dissect their worldview and like their rhetoric, and then how they're damaging the discourse, quote unquote. It's a trip, because a lot of what we're doing is we're having to play, like, not mind reader, because I think it's a little more obvious than that, but like we are still having to like interpret their intentions throughout their actions, and it's this like slippery space, because like for their fans, like when you try to make these claims, their fans will come out and they'll point to like a certain amount of videos or tweets, and they'll be like, look, like they disavowed white nationalism here, or they said that they didn't want a violently created ethno-state here. Like, it's going to be peaceful. You know what I mean? Like they have all this content to kind of, it's like a game that they're playing, and then it forces the critics to be in this defensive position where we have to interpret their intent through all these lenses, and it unfortunately muddies the waters. And this is, again, kind of tying it back to Dave Rubin. This is something that I think Dave Rubin can be blamed for just astronomically above almost anyone else for platforming a lot of these extreme or far-right figures who, when they go on his show, like a Tommy Robinson, when he goes on that show, he'll sanitize his views for that viewer base, and then on his own show, or like when he's giving speeches at a rally, he's a lot more overtly xenophobic and bigoted in these ways. So it's like this weird, it's a very, very complex gray space to critique from.
Yeah, they know what they're doing. They know when they go on Dave Rubin or people like that they are talking to a more mainstream audience, and they have to make their ideas and their arguments more appealing to that. So they can't just come straight out and say, for whites only. They have to, so that's why they appeal to, liberal values, to free speech, because, who could argue against free speech?
Right.
We're all for free speech, and if they can cast themselves as victims who are being censored by, the political correctness or the regressive left or whatever term you want to use, they think they can chip away and gain a few more sympathizers, which they feel which will legitimize their view and smuggle it into the mainstream discourse.
I think I'd be interested to hear your take on this, because I wonder if this is another area where there's space to have a valid critique of the left from the left, in the sense where, because kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, just this whole idea that the right has just done a phenomenal job for what it's worth at taking over, like owning the culture war space by essentially like weighting these terms like identity politics and free speech and individualism and liberty, like they're basically like really hijacking a lot of these terms and then placing them on a field where they have like the advantage, essentially. It's like a home court advantage type of thing. And because of that, obviously, in the culture wars, it places people on the left in this weird defensive position where if you're trying to critique the right from a place of, moral authority and integrity, you don't want to be like using their terminology, because then it kind of plays into their game. But in a way, like, do you find that the left has fallen short in any way in terms of like their hesitation, I guess, to champion the ideas behind like free speech or platforming in some of these ways that have become like center points in the culture wars, as far as like people getting banned on Twitter or kicked off YouTube or whatever? Do you think there's any validity to that critique?
Yes, absolutely. I think some parts of the left who should be very careful in their critique of the free speech argument. That I think, because there's this sort of naive view that the way to defeat, if we can just no platform enough of these right-wingers, if we can get them chucked out of social media, then we'll all be okay. And to me, it's a very naive view, because ultimately it will mean giving more power to the state or to these corporations like Google and Facebook,
right,
to do the work that political struggles should do. Because like the way you fight against the ideas that people like Sargon or Milo or whoever promote is not by censorship or state repression. It is by political and social struggle against the ideas and movements that they promote and to defeat them.
And to that point, I mean, specifically, I know that Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, they've already been in these positions where I know they've banned certain Antifa groups and different leftist accounts. I mean, this is like, it's already happening on the left.
Yeah, precisely. Precisely. That's where it ultimately goes. That you make a rod for your own back, and eventually it's going to boomerang onto you.
Yeah, it's not. I couldn't agree more, man. I think it's definitely it's a sticky situation to be in, and I know that a lot of people, specifically on Twitter, and you know how Twitter is. It's a hell site. You know, like people often bring out their worst sides on there, and I know there's this tendency from the left to just like celebrate deplatforming in a way where, you know, again, kind of going back to trying to pick apart some of these critiques with more nuance, you know, because I know it's easy to not do that and to be more absolutist in our framing. But I mean, I think there is some validity to the critiques in a way where, you know, someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, you know, when he was deplatformed, his career essentially did fall apart. So like the left then has this position where they can be like, oh, look, deplatforming worked. And I think sort of similarly to Alex Jones, you know, it's like taking Alex Jones off all these platforms, like, look, now he's away from the mainstream. It's sort of worked. And I think largely like one of the biggest problems in that approach is just that the people like Milo Yiannopoulos or like Alex Jones are extreme exceptions in like the general space of the political spectrum. I mean, they're people that go above and beyond the means of manipulating platforms. Like these are provocateurs that, you know, have essentially hacked the system to build careers for themselves. And I just think, you know, I hate using the slippery slope argument because I know it can be a fallacy in a lot of ways, but, you know, in a lot of ways when people, you know, jump on those bandwagons to be like, yeah, like I'm glad they're gone, I do find there to be space for critique to be like, okay, like I understand that people view this as it worked, but we also shouldn't be celebrating these multi-billion-dollar tech corporations kicking off whoever they want at any given time, usually with no reason. So that's the thing that I think is worth pointing out.
The deeper problem is that it outsources politics to corporations. Mm-hmm. Or in the case of hate speech laws, it outsources anti-racism to the state. And I think that's where these questions become depoliticized and being turned into narrow legal questions,
right?
Rather than seen as a political and social struggle. Because whether you like it or not, you can chuck them out. You can chuck Sargon off of social media entirely, yet the ideas and beliefs that he argues for and promotes will still be there. They're still going to be there. And they're still going to be there, and they're still going to fester, and you have to challenge it. And I don't think just banning them does that.
I completely agree. Yeah, it's just we have to like really get better. Just like you were saying earlier. I mean, just with a lot of these critiques, we have to get better at getting to the bedrock of a lot of these problems and stop getting so caught up in the surface level kind of, I don't want to call it nonsense, but it's a little bit more trivial when these things come up, because these are things that come and go, that they might be hot in the media for a day or two, but like over time, as we just kind of allow these patterns to keep occurring, it becomes a systemic problem, which we have to really, well, it already is a systemic problem, but it worsens it heightens it, I guess I should say. So we have to really get better at getting down to the foundations of where that problem's coming from.
Can I just quickly sort of emphasize that in making this argument is not to say that these people shouldn't be challenged.
Exactly.
It's the question of how do you challenge them, and censorship or outsourcing activism to corporations is very ineffective and counterproductive.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I just looked at the time, and I know you got to get out of here soon, but just one more quick question. Just I guess we can just wrap this up. It's been a really great conversation. I appreciate your time here. But like moving forward, I guess we could say in the broader political space, between the culture wars and then the actual like political policy debates that are going on across, Europe and America right now. Like, do you think, just generally speaking, that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better? Or what's your take on the next few years?
I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think because with the rise of these anti-immigrant far-right movements, with, the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, unfortunately, I think we're going to see a lot more of them. And I think a lot of this is going to depend on whether Donald Trump gets re-elected in 2020.
Yeah.
And if he does, then that just confirms that we are in a very hard and long struggle. And it means that an alternative between the far right and decrepit neoliberalism is needed more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And we didn't even get to just the rise in American and European, or I should say global nationalism at this point. It's not just America and it's everywhere.
It's you see it in India with the BJP and their sort of Hindu fascism, where Christians and Muslims are increasingly being persecuted and hated upon because the BJP have a history of this.
Yeah, it's moving forward. I mean, globally, it really is. And I don't spend a terrible amount of time on like global like geopolitics, but I know just from following like at a surface level in the news, it really is wild just how the rise of populism and nationalism, it's not a unique thing in America or parts of Europe. I mean, it really is. It's popping up everywhere, and it's again, I think it speaks to these underlying bedrock issues that we're talking about here, where it goes beyond, on a surface, like it looks like, oh, these are just culture wars, these are just political backlash, but like underneath there's like real systemic decades long problems that the world is facing.
Yes, and it speaks to how politics is increasingly being put into cultural and identity terms. So, we've seen like what I think Slavoj Žižek has sort of talked about this, how politics itself has become culturalized. So political and economic struggles are translated into, identity and culture.
Yeah, exactly. Which again goes back to what we were saying earlier, which is why I guess you can't approach these topics through this simplistic, narrow lens of only looking through class or only looking through identity. We have to essentially reach a point, I think, where we're able to offer the most people, I shouldn't say most, the most diverse amounts of people more productive and more inclusive narratives that they can actually cling on to that work. And it's not just like this national, because I think like the tendency in times like this is to cling to nationalism because it's one of those things that unites people. It's like, oh, like we're all German, we're all Japanese, we're all American. And then when you cling to that, like it becomes this very, very easy bridge to attach race to it and then attach all these other forms of identity, and then that essentially just creates more subdivisions within people. So we have to get better and more nuanced, I think, at some form of overarching narrative that brings the most people together in a more progressive way and doesn't lend itself to nationalism and to exclusive means of oppression or forms of bigotry.
But that means reviving a new universalism and humanism. And that's easier said than done.
Awesome. Well, yeah, Ralph, I really appreciate your insights and the time to do this. Again, I think your voice is just really, really helpful, especially in like the Twitter discourse. I hate using the word discourse. It's so funny, but we'll just call it that. I mean, it's very helpful to have people like you who are clearly approaching these topics with a level of, careful nuance where, in a space where most people are just completely throwing caution to the wind and being reckless with their words and their approach. So, I really appreciate your takes and just your involvement with these culture wars and these political movements.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one, man.
All right, you too.